We have seen several colleges of Cambridge. Then I want to ask you a question. What is the different flavor of Cambridge University and Oxford University?
Oxford is the slightly older university than Cambridge. They're roughly 500, 600 years old, both of them. But they do have a very distinctive, different feel about them. I was at Oxford as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate for 5-6 years. And I went to school in Oxford, so I know Oxford nearly as well as I know Cambridge. And I know that Oxford is more ritualistic, is more conservative, is more formal, is more political. Many English prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher and so on went to Oxford. Cambridge is more scientific, more liberal. The difference is Oxford is, in terms of our religion, is high church, what we call high church. Cambridge is low church, is Protestant. It's probably partly to do with the geography, because the area of Cambridgeshire where Cambridge is not very rich. The east of England is not a very rich part of England. They're not big landlords in the same way as in central England around Oxford. So England is split really between the north and west and the south and the east. The south and the east supported Oliver Cromwell. The north and the west supported the king in the Civil War. And so in a way this is liberal and middle class, and Oxford is a bit more aristocratic and a bit more conservative. And the emphasis in the intellectual field, this was where many of the great scientists who challenged Christianity, for example Charles Darwin or other great scientists like Newton, who we've mentioned. This is the great science university, the greatest science university the world has ever seen, Cambridge. Oxford is the great university for literature, politics and philosophy and other things. So there is a slight feeling of difference. Both Oxford and Cambridge started anthropology roughly at the same time. Oxford with E.B. Tylor, Cambridge with Sir James Fraser, and then Haddon, Rivers. And again, the flavour of their anthropology is slightly different, and it reflects what I was saying about their politics. Oxford had its greatest period, perhaps, of anthropology in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the time of Evans Pritchard, who was professor there. And Oxford at that time made an unparalleled contribution to the study of tribal societies, the famous Nua, Zandi studies of Evans Pritchard, for example. And so the study of ritual, religion, magic, witchcraft, kinship was what Oxford excelled at. Cambridge was again more scientific. Haddon was a zoologist, for instance. Rivers was a psychologist. So the impetus here was more scientific, less religious. And so Cambridge's contribution, if you think of Oxford as contributing mainly to the study of tribal societies, oral cultures, integrated worlds like Oxford, which is a very integrated society, Cambridge is more open. And so its great contribution really is to the movement from tribal societies to peasant societies. The work of Edmund Leach on political systems in Highland Burma is an example of trying to bring tribal societies into relation with the state. Jack Goody's work on literacy is another example. So I think Oxford was the greatest British anthropology university between 1940 and 1960. Then I think Cambridge has for a long time been certainly one of the greatest, and in my opinion probably the best anthropology department in Europe in the period of Jack Goody and after Jack Goody for 15-20 years. I think nearly half the teachers of anthropology in the United Kingdom came to Cambridge. So we have very good postgraduates and a very lively department. Oxford became slightly less exciting for various reasons. They had difficulties with their professorship and so on. So there is again a different flavour, and I think you would find that in every discipline, that there's a different emphasis. But they're complementary. They're of course famous rivals when they're having their boat races. I always find it difficult to know who I should support. When I was at Oxford, Oxford always lost and I always supported them. When I came to Cambridge, Cambridge always lost and I supported them. So it's a bit unfortunate. But this is part of the essence of English society. Contradiction. Oxford is always fighting with Cambridge, and yet against the rest of the world they're very united. And in fact, this is one of the famous remarks of how the world works that Evans Pritchard made. You know, King's College is against Queen's College, but when it's a matter of Oxford against Cambridge, then Kings and Queens are united against Oxford. But then when it's a matter of Oxbridge against modern universities, we're united against the London School of Economics. When it's universities against other institutions, we're united against. So you have a system like this. Round, and you feel completely that really necessary. The garden is much rougher and wilder.
Well, I remember seeing a Shakespeare with you last summer. Now, would you please tell me something about the students' relaxation and accommodation?
This is indeed the place where we saw one of the Shakespeare comedies just in this garden. It reminds us that Oxford and Cambridge put a huge emphasis on the other aspects of education, not just sitting in classes and writing essays, but on poetry, on music, on dance, on drama, on a rounded enrichment of young people's lives. They come here at 18 and they should leave not merely with more ideas in their head, but more skills at interrelating with other people, in communicating and in creating on every level. So painting, music, all the arts are very important in Oxford and Cambridge, just as are the games. Oxford and Cambridge are just as famous for their games in some ways. Obviously their boat race, but also their rugby and all the other sports and games that they play, as they are for their academic life. The English have always thought that you can put too much emphasis on the mind. It's the whole body. We have a saying, a sound mind in a sound body. So this is where in the summer they do some of the plays. And so a college has playing grounds. The playing grounds, there are tennis courts and other playing grounds. The university rugby grounds are over there. There are squash courts. So there are many playing grounds as well. There's a music hall over there, and there are music practice rooms. So King's is very famous for its music. It has a choir school where they teach the famous King's College choir, which is over there, just as St John's has a choir school. And there are choral scholars. There's a lot of music, every kind of music, jazz music, in the life of the college. In many ways just as important as their formal education. And this is made partly possible by the way in which the students are accommodated. Instead of, as in many universities, when I went to the London School of Economics, I went into the LSE for my teaching, but then I had to commute right out to the edge of London where I lived, where I could afford to live. In Oxford and Cambridge you have the great privilege of very good central accommodation, because every student, when they come up as an undergraduate and a postgraduate, is encouraged to use college accommodation. This, for example, is a newly built graduate hostel for King's College graduates. The old one is next door. All graduate students and all undergraduates actually live in properties owned by the college, and that means that they can stay together, they can form friendships. They're within walking distance usually of the college. So it becomes a total life. It's a short term, only 8 weeks or so on, but for that time they are as if they're living in a family, but a very large family, i.e. the college. And this again differentiates Oxford and Cambridge from all other universities, which some have halls of residence, but they're often far away from the universities, and often you spend a lot of your time just in accommodation. What was This is King's College Dining Hall, which, as I mentioned, is a very important part of the college life. You can see the students here now eating a meal. It's out of term, so there are not as many as there would be. And the fellows would eat along the top here, but many of them are away on holiday now. This is not an authentic medieval hall, but it's based on a medieval hall. And around the walls are pictures of people who've been associated with the college. When I brought a famous Chinese anthropologist into this hall, he looked at it and said, "This reminds me of something. Ah, a Chinese ancestor hall." And that's really what it is, a Chinese ancestor hall. And there's even one of my ancestors here. Usually you don't have any connections, but one of the previous heads of this college, what we call a provost, was my great-great-uncle. He was the Provost of King's, a very famous ghost story writer, the most famous ghost story writer in the English language, and also a great medieval cataloguer of manuscripts. So we'll go and have a look at his portrait, but as you can see here, this is a relaxed space in which you can communicate. The portrait is, this is M.R. James, Montague Rhodes James, who wrote a book called Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, which are always read on the British Broadcasting Corporation at Christmas. They've made films. They're very, very frightening ghost stories, wonderful stories. But that was his hobby. His real job was a medieval scholar of manuscripts, King's College. He was the Provost of King's College in the early part of the 20th century. There are many famous King's people. This man is Arthur Waley, who was an honorary fellow. He was one of the greatest translators from the Chinese into the English. He translated The Dream of the Red Mansion and many of the great Chinese classics and Japanese classics. He was a superb translator. He translated the Genji, for example, from Japanese. One of the two great translations is by Waley. For instance, my ancestors, intellectual ancestors, Maya Fortes, who was a famous anthropologist and who was a fellow of this college. And when I first came to Cambridge, Maya was here and was very kind to me. And so I feel a link through him to this college.
Here we are at the backs of King's. You see that willow tree. I think it is famous because when our poet Xu Zhimo studied at Cambridge, he wrote about the tree, and the poem became very famous. Do you remember some lines from the poem?
It was very interesting to hear that this famous Chinese poem was written about this willow tree. I don't think many of the fellows know that now. When this poet came to Cambridge, he became friends or was invited by Dady Rylands, who was a member of the famous Bloomsbury group, of which Virginia Woolf and John Maynard Keynes and others were members. And he was obviously very moved by being in Cambridge and wrote this famous poet. So it's lovely to have an association between here and China's great literary tradition in that period. And this view is a very famous one because you have the medieval King's College chapel, the Gothic chapel, started in the middle of the 15th century and being built through the 16th century. Then you have Clare College, which is a 17th century another college with its Clare College Bridge. And then on the right of the college you have the Gibbs building, which is over here you have the long white Gibbs building, which is where my room in the college is and where we'll be going later. And that's 18th century. And this is very typical of the mixtures that you get in Cambridge colleges. The English don't mind mixing together styles. It's very much like their whole culture, which is a hodgepodge, as we say, an accumulation. The Chinese tend to have a wonderful civilization, then pull it all down and start again, as they're doing in Beijing. The English tend to pile one thing on top of another thing, and they don't see any difficulty in having entirely different artistic styles next door to each other. And so much of Cambridge is 19th century, some of it 18th, 17th, 16th and so on. And we enjoy that. And we can trace the history on the ground. The other feature which is notable, which you can see well here, is that, as you see, the lawns and this bit are very formal, very closely cut lawn, and no one allowed on the lawn and so on. When you go across the river, you suddenly get into what is basically an English park, what an English lord would have outside his country house, with animals grazing under the trees. The grass is not kept well at all. So the English like this contrast between the informal, natural kind of landscape here of a country park with the formal grounds. And this might, and indeed is exactly as many of our big country houses like Hatfield House and so on, designed like this. This is basically a country house. And the people who came here for 300 or 400 years were the people who owned the big country houses. They would leave, they would be brought up in a country house, come and live in a country house, then go back and run their estates and run the British Empire. And it was all continuous. So this is a kind of artistic play with nature and wildness. And there is one we walk through.
Yeah, so there wasn't too much. I've been told that.
As fellow of Kings, or as Dong, would you please tell us as much as you like about the college? For example, its history, its architecture, etc. And the university has a church that is great St. Mary's, and nearly all colleges have their own chapels. Does religion play as big a role as it did in Cambridge University?
King's College was founded in 1446 by Henry VI, King of England, and it's a royal foundation which has continued for 550 years. It's based on its very famous chapel, King's College Chapel, which is one of the wonders of the world. Very famous ceiling, very famous stained glass and architecture. And it's a college which has a high reputation in economics, in philosophy, in many subjects. I've been a fellow here since 1971 with a gap, but I've been a fellow for nearly 30 years and I'm very attached to the college. It's a place which mixes traditions, mixes architectures, very open-minded, famous for its anthropological tradition in particular. One of its provosts was Provost Leach, who was an anthropologist, and its architecture spanning the 15th century, the 18th century Gibbs building, and then this reconstructions of the 19th century. And again, you have the eating here, the praying here, the education here, the social life, all mixed together. And as you mentioned, religion is particularly important here. These were basically like monasteries. The fellows were not allowed to marry. They had to live in the college and pray and work. It was part of their duty was praying as well as working. So for a long time it was a religious tradition, and they still have an overtone of the Church of England about them. But now obviously that's not quite as important, but the music and the beauty and the art is still very important as a feature of the college. And this is an icon of Britishness, because every Christmas they have the famous carols on television from here, and it's somehow associated with Englishness. Okay? So we're going to go into my room in Gibbs building, 18th century building, and there's something peculiar about this. Imagine when this was built, this was where the fellows of the college lived. These were their houses. They weren't just rooms. They weren't married, and they lived in little apartments in here. So when you go in here, imagine this whole thing as a large village. And when we go through this door here, if you come through this door, we're actually going into a street of this village. It may look like an ordinary door, but it's actually a vertical street with houses off it. So there's a house there, and sort of 8 houses or whatever it is, or 6 houses up here. So each of these are houses. Each house has its front door, and this is made of oak. And there's a famous phrase which describes how in Oxford and Cambridge you sport. That means you put up or demonstrate your oak. You sport your oak, and that means that you shut this front door and no one can disturb you. You may be inside, but it's very thick. If you bang, and no one will hear you. So this gives you complete privacy. At the moment now, in the past there would be just one name there. There's now 4 names. Professor F. Statue is a famous scientist. The dean is the person who looks after the college chapel. And Professor Mackenzie is also a very famous scientist. He was one of the co-discoverers of tectonic plates, which is very important in geophysics. And then my name there. So this is my little house off this street. So you open the front door and you find another door. And this is the door which shows you are in, but you are still quite private, and on here you would pin notices saying, would my students please come tomorrow and see me, or whatever. And there's a little hole here which my granddaughters like for putting your hand through and opening the outer door if you're on the inside. So you open this door, and then there's another door. The English measure their status by the numbers of doors between them and the outside world. So we had the college outside gate, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 so far, and some more to come. So if you'd like to come in to my room. 5, and then through to my inner room, 6, 7. So I've got 7 doors between me. That means I'm a very superior person. It's like having 7 telephones or whatever it is. Funnily enough, of course, if you go around the back, you can just come through the window. So there's always a back way in. Now, this outer room, the plan of these little houses, which is what they were, was that, and they're all the same, was that this outer room was your dining room, your public room, if you had a group of people meeting together. So this was like a front drawing room, what we call a drawing room in England. So this is where most people would come as far as this. It's what the French might say, vous, you. And then inside here, these 2 other rooms, one was your bedroom, and the other was your study. That was moi, me, I. And so you could go into complete privacy. Now this room, as you see, is quite grand, and it was furnished out of some of the college furnishings. This college had the good fortune to have one of the greatest 20th century economist in the world. John Maynard Keynes was the bursar of this college, and he collected paintings and other things. So we have one of the famous painters of what was known as the Bloomsbury Group, Virginia Woolf and so on, Roger Fry. This is a famous Roger Fry self-portrait. He was one member. He was an expert on Chinese art, among other things. Another member of the Bloomsbury Group was one of the greatest artists, novelists of the 20th century, E.M. Forster. He wrote Passage to India and other things. And this was E.M. Forster's clock. Forster lived in a room further up this. And over here is a wardrobe which belonged to John Maynard Keynes. And I now use it to entertain my granddaughters, who I tried to persuade that this is the way into the magic land of Narnia, as described in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. So they go in there, hunt around, and then hop out here. So this is, at the moment I share this with the Dean. I have some of my books, these are my books along here, and his books over here. So we share this outer room. But when I want to teach, I then go into my inner room. Yep. I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you anything about them. That's a famous poet, I think, Edmund Waller. I don't know who these are. I'd have to look them up. They come and they go. That's another quite famous artist, but I'm not sure who it is. So, anyway, I've been in this room since 1981, so 25 years. When I first came, there was a historian out here. This place was full of books. He died. I have his old gown in here. And then he was followed by a famous sociologist and classicist, Professor Keith Hopkins, and he died about 3 years ago, and I have his gown and his things here. So I'm gradually getting dead men's gowns. So this is moi, this is my inner chamber. Come in. And I keep objects. These are quite useful because a lot of my students are quite shy and nervous, and it helps them that I have a dead snake from Hong Kong, which you make medicine with, or a bowl for timing rituals in the Himalayas, or if you cut someone's head off in the Naga peoples, you get one of these badges, or if you're doing a religious ritual in Burma, you do that, or if you're having bound feet in traditional China, then ladies would wear these things. So, or if you cut off a woman's hair in the Naga land, you can make an ornament to a basket. So this is typical anthropological bric-a-brac from around the world, and photographs of people I love and so on. And then this is where I read and think. The wonderful thing about this place is it has no telephone. although I do have a mobile phone, but I switch it off. It does now, unfortunately, have a computer broadband, but I try and resist the temptation of using that. This is just a quiet place to meditate, to look out over the lawns with a beautiful view, and this is where I teach my PhD students and my undergraduates. Oxford and Cambridge started in a period in the later Middle Ages, the 14th, 15th centuries, when there was no printing press. All knowledge had to be written down by longhand. The number of books was quite small, and as a result, it was the way knowledge was transmitted was by the word of mouth. So basically, your teacher was also your book. And the way in which teaching was done was that you would take an apprentice, that is a young person, who would come and decide to study with you, as if they were studying writing, calligraphy, or some art. They would apprentice themselves, and then through your supervision and teaching, they would finally become a master of arts, an MA. And therefore it was a direct apprenticeship system. You would teach them, they would pay you a little bit, help you clean your shoes or whatever it was that you needed doing. And you would transmit A, all your knowledge, and B, your skills. And the skills were the important thing. And the central art of it was based on the Greek method of disputation. Basically, you would say to a student, this week I would like you to read a chapter of Aristotle's Politics and to summarize what his main arguments are and what, in the light of more recent theories, is wrong with, or you disagree with, or you criticize. A week later you would come and you'd say, this is what Aristotle says, but my views are this. Your teacher would then say, but you haven't understood what Aristotle was really saying, or that's a very good point, but would you like to elaborate it a bit? So you would get into a conversation in which he would be testing you almost as if you were playing a game. You would fire a little as if you were playing tennis or a game like that. You would send a bit of knowledge or information to your teacher, who would then send it back to you, and it became a game, or like fighting with swords, learning that, or judo, or any of these competitive games. And you would be taught. He would start gently with you and then gradually increase his attacks on you, so that by the time you finished your time there, you could then go out into the world, and if you ended up as a politician or a general or a lawyer or whatever, you could very quickly learn how to deal with people's arguments, make decisions, decide what was the best course of action. So it taught you the skills of life. The knowledge, the actual content of the knowledge, whether it was mathematics or logic or philosophy or whatever it was, in some ways was less important. This was a subject, a topic around which you could learn the arts of logic, rhetoric, argument, and so on. And this was done 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. Now, that system, which is very expensive on time and effort, was maintained like a fossil in Oxford and Cambridge right up to this day. I teach in this room. I often have just one student as an undergraduate in their first year. They come in, one student, and I teach them for an hour. I see them every week, right through a term, sometimes through a year. I've had one student who I taught every week for 3 years. She went on and then became my PhD student. And you may see some of her film later in this series, Sofka Zinoviev. So you teach your students like this and become very close to them. You become almost a parent to them in some ways. You take over the responsibilities towards them. It's quite a strong relationship with one senior person. And this system of supervisions, as it's called, or tutorials, continues in Oxford and Cambridge. Now, the new universities really can't afford to do this. They have to teach in larger groups. It's too expensive. And so you get seminars. Now in a seminar of 15, 20 people, you just sit there, you listen to, one of you talks every week, you listen, you have a bit of a discussion, you may make one point, you learn things, it's quite a good way of learning, but it doesn't teach you this kind of interpersonal skill which the supervision does. And so, although it's the most expensive system in the world, it means that the teaching in Oxford and Cambridge is better than anywhere else in the world. It's been, some of the American universities, like Harvard, which were developed out of Oxford and Cambridge, have some elements of this, but even there, they're less good because, to a certain extent, because, again, professors' time is so expensive that a lot of this kind of teaching is done by very junior faculty or by PhD students. Even Oxford and Cambridge are finding that their senior staff are having to produce books, and so more and more of their teaching is done by junior people. But we still preserve this, and if I'm asked by this college to teach an undergraduate in their first year, I'm very happy to do that. I like teaching first year students. So that's the supervision system.
Oxbridge has also created what is called fellowship. What is the nature of this fellowship? As a fellow of King's, what are your responsibilities?
I'm a fellow of King's College, and the meaning of fellowship is really very central to the understanding of Oxford and Cambridge life. It has, the meaning of the word really means people who are close, who are friends, who are equal, who trust each other, and who work to each other and have a mutual commitment to the same goals and project. It's a very English idea. You have the fellowship of the knights, King Arthur's knights. That was an early use of it. They were all members of the Round Table. No one was superior. It was a round table to make them equal. So we are like knights of the Round Table. And so when you are elected into a fellowship, it changes you from just being a free-floating individual to being committed to a college or an institution, rather like a club, but a more important club because it has many goals and aims. The main aim, obviously, is to educate and to take care of your students. And so when you become a fellow, you take on the responsibilities of not only managing this place. It's a big, complicated architectural and financial institution. So we have to manage that, and we have to keep it in good order, and we are trustees of this. It's been passed on to us for 550 years. I am one of the 100 or so fellows who have to pass it on to the next generation, make it a perpetual, like a Chinese, it's very like a Chinese lineage or family group. So I'm like the head of a Chinese family. I have a responsibility to my children, to my grandchildren, to the whole order. I have my ancestors in the chapel and in the hall there, and it all flows on down through me. It's all right. Basically, a fellow's responsibilities are to, when we take our vow, we say we will maintain the college as a place of education, religion, teaching, research. And that's basically what we have to do. We have to do all those things. And as a result of that, I can have a sense of trust. If I need help or if I need advice, I can go to other fellows. And this again is very important because it breaks down the barriers. When I wrote my book on tea, for example, I needed help on biochemistry. I know nothing about biochemistry. I could go to a good biochemist and he would spend an hour explaining the basic thing that I needed. So collaboration between disciplines is made possible. And also, the English are quite lonely people. And although we have our small families, otherwise we don't belong to anything. And belonging to a college gives you a sense of belonging to a community. This is the only community we have. And the wonderful thing about Oxford and Cambridge is that it's for life. When I retire in 3 years' time, I will remain at least an emeritus fellow of King's. And so if I want to come here, walk across the grass, have a dinner, whatever, I can do that for the rest of my life. And this was because it was really for unmarried, for a long time it was for unmarried people, and they would die in their college. So it's something very special, very English, and it's really to be found in Oxford and Cambridge. And the most famous of all colleges in Oxford and Cambridge is King's College, Cambridge. So I feel very privileged, and thank you for interviewing me about it.
Thank
Okay?
you very much.
Okay?
Looking forward.
Okay. We'll just walk across the grass. Normally you wouldn't be allowed to walk across the grass. No one is allowed except fellows of the college. It's a very peculiar feature of the English class system and privilege system, is that it mainly stops other people doing something. So you can hunt on this land, someone else can't stop. Most societies give you things which you can do. The English prevent most people from doing things and then allow a select portion who demonstrate their superiority by walking across. I can only walk across the grass in King's College. And this is, at a wider level, what it signifies is that this is my grass. Because the odd thing about a fellowship is that you become a fellow. It's like becoming a member of a family. I'm not just a fellow for a year or two. Once you are incorporated in an important ritual that takes place in the chapel here, where they put a vow, and the provost puts his hand on his head and says, "I admit you," in Latin, in a very sacred place. So it's like being admitted into a religious order or something like this. Once you are admitted, you change. You are now a fellow, and you are a fellow for life. To a certain extent, I can always walk across this grass, even if I go abroad or whatever. And it means that as you join this fellowship, and the concept of fellowship is very important, you become like a family. You have responsibilities and you have duties. I have responsibilities to help govern the college, and I have privileges, and one of the privileges is obviously walking on the grass, and another one is getting wine and having a nice room and so on. So there's a balance of responsibilities and privileges, but I'll talk more about the responsibilities in a minute. This is possibly the character who's coming to see me.
Oh, so,
Well, if it is, we'll watch him, and if he goes to that, I think it is. I'll tell him what we're doing, okay?